Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Nairobi's fury over the sacking of the Kenyan chief of peacekeeping troops in South Sudan has not abated. President Kenyatta rails against what he says was the preordained decision to name his countryman as the fall guy. Also, South Africa's Jacob Zuma's leadership sinks even deeper into crisis. The president now faces a no-confidence vote in Parliament next week. This after a state anti-corruption watchdog said it found possible evidence of government corruption. And as Morocco gears up to host delegations from over 200 countries in Marrakesh next week for the COP22 Global Climate Change Summit, we take a closer look at what African nations can do to speed up their response to the increasingly frequent environmental disasters. Well, Nairobi said that the sacked Kenyan commander of UN peacekeeping in South Sudan was set up to be the fall guy. It's railed against what it says was pressure from some Security Council nations for a preordained outcome of a damning UN probe into peacekeepers in Juba. Lieutenant General Johnson Odienki was fired after an investigation found that soldiers had failed to protect civilians during heavy fighting in July. Odienki had only been in the post 3 weeks at the time. Kenya's president said his country will not be hung out to dry and is pulling its 1,000 troops from South Sudan.
We know that the people of South Sudan want peace. We know that the people of this region want peace in South Sudan. But we also know that peace will not come to South Sudan by blaming a Kenyan commander for the wider failings of the mission to South Sudan. So therefore, for our part, we will no longer contribute to a mission that has failed to meet its mandate and which has now resorted to scapegoating Kenyans.
So some damning stuff there from Kenyatta. On its part, the UN has denied Kenya's claims. The report had found that a lack of leadership in the UNMISS mission led to a chaotic response and peacekeepers abandoning their posts or ignoring panic calls for help from those facing being attacked, raped or killed. Julia Steers tells us more.
They're not specifically singling out Kenyan troops, and I'm told that the Kenyan government's really strong and swift reaction to the news is largely due to the fact that they were not made aware of this firing before it became public. So there is part of this that is essentially a bit of lashing out on the government's part. But, you know, these same sources in the Kenyan government say it comes down to a matter of respect as well, and that Kenya has felt underappreciated for its efforts in partnership with the UN in the region, and that this episode has brought to light some of those underlying tensions. It's important to note that historically Kenya has played a key role in housing refugees from South Sudan and Somalia and in hosting multilateral discussions with South Sudanese leaders and foreign diplomats. So they really are a critical partner with the UN in East Africa, and strained relations as a result of this episode could have a ripple effect throughout the region, and particularly as we see, instability in South Sudan, in Somalia, and in Ethiopia increasing.
So does this political fallout risk diverting attention away from the inherent problems within the UN's peacekeeping setup?
Definitely, there is a broader conversation to be had here around the efficacy of the peacekeeping force that still remains in South Sudan and really across the region. The firing of Odienki came as a result of this special internal investigation released by the UN this week, and that highlighted underperformance across the board on the part of the UN apparatus in response to this violence in July, and that violence led to the deaths of thousands of civilians, 2 peacekeepers, and the collapse of a peace agreement in the country. And it's widely acknowledged that what happened in Juba in July was really a large-scale failure of the UN peacekeeping system.
Julia Steers there for us in Nairobi. Well, protesters in the city were tear-gassed by police on Thursday. The anti-corruption rally was quickly broken up, but not before organisers delivered speeches calling for President Uhuru Kenyatta to step down. He's come under fire from some quarters after last month blaming institutional graft on others and saying that he could do no more to rein it in. Kenyatta had made a campaign pledge to clamp down on corruption, and his opponents say he's been slow to act. South Africa's Jacob Zuma's leadership sinks ever deeper into crisis. The president now faces a no-confidence vote in Parliament next week. That's been called after a state probe found possible evidence of corruption and influence peddling in his government.
As pressure in South Africa mounted on Jacob Zuma to resign, he was probably glad to be in neighbouring Zimbabwe to discuss trade. Robert Mugabe, who's been in power since 1980, joked about Zuma's troubles.
We are happy you came, and we are happy you are still in one piece in spite of what the papers are writing every day.
A report by South Africa's anti-corruption watchdog stopped short of saying crimes had been committed, but it said a judge must investigate Zuma's relationship with the wealthy Gupta family. On Thursday, the main opposition party called for a no-confidence vote. It is set for November the 10th.
It's become quite clear that our country has been run by a mafia syndicate. And it is time, in fact, for Parliament to do what it's constitutionally bound to do, which is to fire Jacob Zuma.
Zuma is increasingly criticised by the opposition and also by some members of his party, the ANC. But he still retains deep loyalty in large sections of the ANC, especially in rural areas. Zuma has already survived 2 no-confidence votes this year. The ANC is due to choose a new party leader at the end of 2017.
Ahead of the international COP22 climate talks next week, Morocco is gearing up to host delegations from over 200 countries to discuss together moving forward in tackling global environmental challenges. Well, with this in mind, earlier I spoke to one of those who'll be attending the conference. He's the Director General of African Risk Capacity. It's part of the African Union and uses insurance to help governments from the continent prepare and respond to climate disasters. Africa is responsible for only a tiny proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, but is already suffering disproportionately from rising temperatures. Now, he told me of his hopes for COP22.
COP21 was the time for decision, long-waiting decisions. And as you know, tomorrow will be the entry into force of the treaty. And we hope strongly that COP22 will be time for action. Now it's time to implement the decisions that were taken last year, and particularly for the African Risk Capacity, which is an instrument for the African Union, a specialized agency, in order to combat disaster risk. For us, we would like this to be the time for African nations, nations of the world, to work together with Africa in order to build disaster management and financing in the right way for the entire continent, particularly for those countries that are most vulnerable.
So you want to see change, but what needs to change in terms of the way that disaster risk is tackled at the moment?
What needs to change is the way the whole disaster risk management is taken care of. As you know, today when there is a disaster, we go through an appeal. And by the time we get to the action, time goes on 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, sometimes a year. And what happens is that families lose their livelihoods, they lose their seeds, their implements, and more frequently, they leave their area in the rural areas. They move to the cities and sometimes try to cross the Mediterranean. So, and you see sometimes with frequency of drought, even instability, political instability in the countries. So we want that to change, but to change in a sustainable manner. And how? By building the capacities at national level, by transforming public policies, by embedding into national systems the management and the financing of disaster risk through insurance.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.